Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. Over the past few years in the United States, we've seen some horrific examples of racism directed at Black Americans, Latinos, Asians, Jewish people, and those of Arab descent. Amid all these tragedies and public protests that have followed, many U.S. business leaders promised that they would do their part to fight the problem. They committed to making their workplaces more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. They also came out strong. But for the past 2 years, they've really been struggling hard to put their words into actions and actually seizing the small window of opportunity to make lasting change. Our guest today is Richard Sharpe, an anti-racist activist and historian on race and discriminatory policy in Canada. Richard Sharpe, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you for having me.
Anti-Black racism in the United States is expansive and insidious in how it informs institutional behavior, policies, and really daily living. Could we start off with what is anti-Black racism, and is it different from simply being non-racist?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the difference between anti-Black racism and racism is that it's really focused on people of African descent. And of African descent, I mean people with kinky hair, broad nose, big lips, like we are the targets, the people that were the principal victims of the transatlantic slave trade. So anti-Black racism, it's in Canada, and I think in the United States and other Western countries, it's everywhere. It's foundational to our nation states, and it means that we end up dealing with it on a daily basis, sometimes all the time, in ways that is as we've seen in terms of the impacts on our communities, really detrimental in terms of quality of life and sort of access to education, those kinds of things, but also in terms of how white people and other racialized groups see us. So anti-Black racism can happen to us, not just, it's not perpetrated against us as Black people in North America or across the African diaspora, not just perpetrated by white people, but it's also perpetrated against us by other racialized groups. So that's really the distinction, the difference. Like there's, racism in general, where people don't like people because they're different, like the xenophobic stuff. But the stuff that's really zeroes in and focuses on Black people, that's the work that I've been primarily focused on over the last couple of years.
In June 2020, hundreds of people gathered, held protest vigils for Black lives lost at the hands of police. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau attended the Ottawa demonstration, famously took the knee, at one point in solidarity with the anti-racism demonstrators gathered on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. What does the research tell us about anti-Black racism in Canada?
So anti-Black racism, I would go back actually to a report that was done by a United Nations Special Working Group to Canada in 2016 that came to Canada. They were part of the UN Human Rights Council. And they came to Canada to check out what's happening with people of African descent. They've been knocking on the door to Canada come for a long time. And then when they finally came in, they did some research and they did some investigation. And what was, I think, surprising to a lot of people here in Canada is that they found that anti-Black racism is endemic. It's normalized in Canada. People think it's normal. They think it's normal that we have high rates of incarceration. It's normal that we have people that people consider Black people more as criminals. It's normal that we don't have any Black people, few Black people leading, our government institutions at the federal level. We've never had a Black deputy minister in the history of our federal public service, even though we've been here since first contact with the people of this country. So what we do see, across the gamut is a desire on the part of folks, when they've seen this data and when they see this report, to want to do something about it. But I find that institutions themselves are not really all that. They don't really have those skills. They don't have the knowledge and expertise. They need that to come from communities. They need that to come from us. We have lived experience, we have knowledge, we have history, and we have the impetus and the desire to see our people and our citizenry in this country do better. The report and other reports have found that every successive generation of Black people living in our country, Canada, has done worse than the previous generation. Wow. And that's a remarkable statistic, because that's not happening for other groups. So there's something happening here. We see the quality of life in some cases in African countries that are, some of the fastest growing economies in the world. On the African continent, the quality of life is getting better, education attainment is getting better. But here, sort of globally, we see the opposite. So why is that? When some of us are born here, some of us have been educated just like everybody else. I don't think that we're not innately different, other than the color of our skin and our generational historical background. So that's really what the data says, that we're going backwards in many respects as a nation when it comes to Black people. And so we need to do something very different in order to change that trajectory.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also curious about, what's going on with the Indigenous community as well. In 2020, Indigenous protesters and former Aboriginal liaison Anne Majeskin drew connections between colonialism and racism. She said, quote, "Indigenous people across Canada have been fighting a battle for people to understand who we are and understand our history in Canada. This has been done in numerous different ways, and that this conversation can't stop happening." What is the relationship, you think, between colonialism and racism, the endemic racism that we see in Canada?
Well, the endemic racism that we see not only in Canada but in North America, like racism is foundational to it. In order to go to somebody else's house and take all their stuff and then relocate them into some place that's not very easy to live, you have to dehumanize them. You have to create a narrative for yourself that these people are subhuman. And so racism is a tool. It's just designed to help people get to an end. And unfortunately, that end was sort of genocidal practices here in this country, but also the genocidal practice of the transatlantic slave trade for us as Black people. So what the Indigenous people are saying in this country, and we totally in an alliance and support of what they're saying, is that their histories and their stories about who they are and their ancestry must play sort of a central role in the co-design and co-development of initiatives and strategies to address their situation, their condition in this country, and their access to land and that sort of thing. Black people really, to a large extent, are asking for fairly similar things in terms of co-design and co-development of initiatives where we are part of the leadership of and ideas and implementation of programs and strategies to address our issues and concerns in this country. Because if we leave it to people who, ancestrally, who were descendants of the people that, cause all of this, then we find that we're in the same place, if not, like I said, going backwards. So it's really, 2020 was, 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement in June of 2020, and the subsequent work that we were able to do during that time was remarkable. It was a remarkable moment in time. We had never moved the needle so far and so fast. Because in that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, white people and white people in power, and everybody actually saw how the sort of agents of the state can bleed the life out of a black man who's crying for his mama. So when we all saw that this is what being black really means in Canada, we were able to capitalize on that and move, and we were able to move fairly quickly. But with all kinds of initiatives, well, I shouldn't say moments in history like that, where people were able to tap into the humanity and the loss of humanity of Black people. I think that given how rooted white supremacy is in the fabric of our nation, it only lasts so long. It's a bit fickle. Then people point out the elastic band of sort of, I wouldn't say mediocrity, but the elastic band of status quo contracts back to where it was before. So what we try to do is make gains as sort of with an activist agenda. Make gains wherever we can, understanding that the entire society is structured around this sort of white normative, and that white normative means that white people are on the top, other racialized groups are in the middle, and Black people are at the bottom. So that's the kind of thing we need to try to change with all the data and information that we have at our disposal.
Canada's anti-racism strategy 2019 to 2022 is a $45 million investment that will take immediate steps in combating racism and discrimination based on what you've shared, but based on what they're seeing in the research. What perspective does your work bring to this agenda?
Well, I think not only myself, but other Black leaders in the country have been trying to work with the anti-racism secretary at the federal level to ensure that anti-Black racism is front and center in that work. We cannot have, like the anti-racism secretary was formed because Black people advocated and pushed for that to happen. Again, this comes down to us working with institutions to address the people who are the most marginalized within your society, and the most marginalized. You need to address those issues first, or centralize that first. And here in Canada, that's the Black and Indigenous communities. And when you're able to do that, you're able to address all of the needs of other groups who are also suffering from racism or other forms of discrimination. Jewish and ethnic discrimination, Muslim discrimination. Black people are part of all of those groups, including the Jewish community, and we're at the bottom of all groups if you look at intersectionality, right? So if you're able to focus on the needs of the people who are at the bottom of all groups, which are Black and Indigenous people, persons with disabilities who happen to be touching on those identity factors, then you can develop programming that's effective. If you kind of do this sort of namby-pamby diversity and inclusion illusion thing, where you kind of sprinkle programming around that where everybody seems happy. What we've seen over the generations of this work, either through employment equity legislation, multiculturalism legislation, you see that what happens to Black communities is that we're left behind. So that's why you need to have a particular focus on Black, and we were able to do that with quite the sense of urgency in June of 2020, and for I would say almost 2 years. Until the door is starting to close and things are moving more to the right than to the middle or the left. So that's really sort of my perspective on that.
Let's talk a little bit about, to your point, things are winding down, but I also wonder about the responsibility of the corporate sector, right? Multinational corporations have a role to play in resetting in many ways. And I wonder if you have a playbook, a guide for what anti-racist leadership looks like in the corporate space.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because the corporate space is not about, rights and justice for human beings. It's about, making sure your shareholders are happy.
Yeah.
And if your sort of economic system is designed around making sure that a very small percentage of folks get most of the wealth and everybody else, too bad, so sad, then, really and truly focusing on Black life or Black representation in corporate boardrooms is not really a priority for those folks. If it means that they might get, I think, and we've seen this over the last 2 years, a lot of corporate organizations did sort of promise and say that they were going to make change and they were going to become more diverse and representative of the populations that they, I wouldn't say serve, but of the population. And that's just not really happening. I think that it's not really the corporate space really where those changes need to be made. It's really the focus of communities to engage their governments to make those changes. Governments can regulate business and industry and create requirements for sort of representation of at least organizations that touch on sort of federal and provincial jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And I think that, the corporate world will do it when it makes business sense for them to do so.
Yeah.
And so for us, we have to some extent, take that into consideration. The longer game when dealing with corporate world is what's the bottom line, peace. I always say, if we deal with these issues, you get peace. And I'm not saying peace and sort of, I'm not worried about tires burning in the street. Canadians are too polite for that.
Yeah.
But what we do, what you can do when you don't have that sort of societal unrest is that people don't buy products. People vote a particular way. People de-invest in places where they don't think their children are going to be able to thrive and survive. They move elsewhere. And so we have to think about that in economies like on the African continent that are, probably going to be doing better than us in 20 years or so. But where do we want to situate ourselves? Do we want to be known as nation states, Western nation states that don't support Black communities or Black people when Black people are going to make up 25% of the planet's population in 30 years. So that's a long game. I think we do have to have the long game. I have my 30-year plan and I'm at 27 of my 30-year plan.
Yeah.
So I might not be around for to see the fruits of all the labor, but I do understand that we need to go in that direction. It's not just a short wins. Short wins are important, but how do we make change for the long term? And that's partly what you're talking about. I think we focus on what makes the most sense for the corporate world in terms of supporting from a business perspective, because they're not going to do it for human rights reasons. And how do we engage our governments so that they do the right thing?
Abraham Kendi, author of a whole bunch of books about anti-racism, including Anti-Racist Baby, writes that raising our children to be anti-racist is like dressing their minds in armor before we send them out into the world. I'm thinking now about the next generation, our kids, right? What messages in practice make up that armor, you think?
Yeah, we had to deal with this even personally here in Canada with my own family. We took our kids out of the school system. They were experiencing racism early, like grade 2, where they were being told they're violent, they're too active, they can't learn, all this nonsense. It's like, you know what? I remember this when I was going through school. So I'm going to pull my kids out. We pulled our kids out. And so we held them close. So the first thing I always say to parents is like, hold your kids close. Believe your children.
That's
when
right.
they say that things are happening to them at school, like we're taught as like Caribbean parents would, the first instances was to discipline us because we were behaving in school. But if you go to school and the teacher's treating you differently from the other kids, or they have lower expectations, or they're streaming you into programming that you shouldn't be in because you're smarter than that, you're better than that.
Yeah.
People act out even at a young age. These things are subtle. So hold your kids close. The first thing, give them under their own sense of identity and history. My eldest son's name is Mandela.
Mm.
Big name, two big names he's got. My middle daughter's name is Moksha, which means nirvana in Sanskrit.
Mm-hmm.
My youngest daughter's name is Shahrazad, which has a sort of Persian background. And we gave them names because of names that are not sort of Western, these are nice white names. We gave them these names that are global in nature, so that they would be grounded from the get-go. And so history is good, supporting them. As parents, we end up having to support our kids in schools. I could tell you lots of stories about that, but we don't have the hours and hours. But my activism went out of the classroom and into the legislature province with respects to addressing anti-Black racism and the need for data. So there's into fortifying them, yes, giving them that education, letting them understand where they came from. Probably one of the biggest things that I feel that you can ever do to your children and Black children is to take them someplace where Black people are the majority. If it's a place that doesn't have, a lot to offer in terms of, splash and vacation beach, those things have an enormous impact on kids because they see that they're not being treated differently. They're not being followed around the mall. They're not being othered. If anything, they're othered because they're foreigners, but it's different when you're a foreigner, right? It's not like you don't belong here because of the color of your skin, which oftentimes we feel here. So there are things that we can do both here in our home countries in the West, and also by taking them elsewhere and giving them exposure to others. Some people have religion, some people have community organizations. Like I took my kids, I used to take my kids in their baby car seat to my community activism meetings.
That's right.
And so even though they were babies, somehow that stuff,
didn't fall on deaf ears.
Is absorbed into, by osmosis. And I think that's important.
Let's talk a little bit about white fragility. It's something, I don't know how much time we have, but white fragility. Robin DiAngelo wrote this book with the said title, published in 2018, shot up to the bestseller list after protests over the death of George Floyd reignited discussions about racism in America. And she just makes the circuit with corporate talks, which is great. Two big questions. How do we deal with the possibility that some people are energized by oppressing others? We've been talking about that. But also, what are your thoughts on, if not the book, this idea of white fragility?
So for sure, I've seen it. I've seen, sometimes I feel like that bird watcher in that New York park when you're raising these issues and these folks start crying out of sort of kind of like a frustration and an anger that they're being called out on their racism. And it's real. I think that again goes back to that white normative, that people think that this society was built, that white people think this society was built around their experience and their history. And that they have a right to the privilege of their experience that they have. And then when some of that privilege is called out, some of the behavior is called out as being sort of racist, inappropriate, that becomes a personal thing because it's trying to wait for the crinkling to stop in the kitchen. That becomes when folks experience a challenge to what they feel is foundational because they feel like they're good people. They find it to be hurtful. They find they get angry. They get angry. They feel hurt. They feel sad. They feel guilty. And I think that white guilt is probably one of the most dangerous things that can happen to Black people. I think white guilt translates into solitary confinement in prisons, over policing. It translates into school expulsions, immigration policy that preferences white and other racialized groups other than Black folk. Like for me, that's white rage as it translates through policy and through the implementation of services and that sort of thing. So I think that how we get over that, because I think we have to talk a little bit about solutions here.
For sure.
Is that we have to talk about this from, maintaining people's humanity, from my perspective, anyways, because I think where I've been able to reach people, white, black, different racialized backgrounds, is that, so we're being dehumanized, and that's okay because people have been taught that we're subhuman. But I also say that, well, white people are being dehumanized too, and other racialized groups are being dehumanized through the process of dehumanizing others. We treat dogs and cats better than we treat other human beings that are black in this country. And that has a lot to do with the fact that these animals can give unconditional love, right? And we don't, black people don't give unconditional love. Love is conditional. You do right by us and we'll love you back, right?
Yeah.
So I think that part of that is that it touches people at a more of an emotional level, at a human level.
Yeah.
You have to humanize this work. It's not just about the numbers. It's not just about the data. It's also about making sure that we have a shared humanity and stake in this. And if I am dehumanized, so are you. You're not a better person by denying me opportunities to employment or a place to live or an education, or for tasering me to death, like the poor teacher out in Los Angeles. That doesn't make you a better human being. And if you stop and slow things down and talk about what does make a good human being, it means doing all the anti-racist and anti-oppression work that we have been, as community activists and scholars, have been pushing out there.
Let's talk about allyship. What should advocacy and activism look like in this era, in this time?
So the first thing, and I pushed this a lot during the June of 2020, is that people have to do the work themselves to learn, what is a Black experience in Canada? What is a Black experience in North America? What's a Black experience globally? Do some of that work yourself before you're going to say you're going to be an ally or a co-conspirator. Because you can't come with eyes glazed over and say, wow, I didn't know any of this. Maybe you didn't, but it's your responsibility to get yourself up to speed to some extent. And we definitely, as Black activists, can help you. Second thing is to listen. We're taught to some extent, and not to always, but here in Canada, we listen to when white women speak to sexual harassment, discrimination, more than we listen to when a Black person or a racialized person brings up issues of racism. So you have to listen and hear that what they're saying is their truth. And so what are they saying? What does it mean? Can we listen without judgment? Can we listen without fear that we're going to be implicated? Can we listen in an open way that allows for dialogue and actually move towards solution? If you block things off, it's like, I'm not going to listen to this guy complaining again, this Richard Sharpe guy complaining again that doesn't like what's happening, then we don't get anywhere. Third thing is to ask how you can help. Don't come in and say, here, I've got a program for you. Here's some money for you to help your Black communities. That's not asking. Ask what it is that we want. What is that things that we need? And we will tell you if we're given the space to do so. And the last one that is really important for folks who want to be true allies, and these are not just people, but institutions, governments, businesses, is to create space for Black people to do their thing. Create space for Black people to lead. Create space for Black people in your organizations, at your parent-teacher council. Create space so that we can be part of not only the dialogue, but of the build of a new society where we are not at the bottom of that pyramid. Because at the end of the day, that's going to be better for everybody, not just for Black folk. It's certainly people that we can start washing away that guilt when people can be part of building a truly just society. We're not there yet, and we've got a long way to go.
Long way to go indeed. Richard Sharpe, anti-racist activist and historian of race and discriminatory policy in Canada. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.